On the morning of January 10th, 2000, two men shook hands in front of the world's press. The deal they announced was the largest merger in corporate history, $165 billion. The marriage of the world's largest internet company and the world's largest media company. Wall Street called it the dawn of a new era. Within 2 years, the combined company reported a $99 billion loss, the largest annual loss any company has ever recorded in American history. That loss has never been surpassed. Here is what happened in the room before the handshake. The version you've heard before goes like this. Two visionary CEOs dreamed of combining old media and new media. The dot-com bubble burst, and the dream collapsed. The end. That version leaves out the most important detail. Steve Case, AOL's co-founder and CEO, knew his business was dying. Not potentially dying. Not at risk. Dying. By late 1999, broadband internet was starting to replace dial-up. AOL's entire business model ran on dial-up subscriptions. AOL's stock was at a historic high, inflated by dot-com euphoria to a market capitalization of $226 billion. Case understood that the inflated stock was a wasting asset. The moment the bubble burst, AOL's currency would collapse. So he did something that took extraordinary nerve, or extraordinary recklessness, depending on how you look at it. He used AOL's inflated stock as currency to buy something real. He bought Time Warner while he still could. What follows is drawn from 3 primary sources. Alec Klein's investigative book, Stealing Time, based on hundreds of confidential company documents and interviews with key players. The SEC investigation findings, which ultimately resulted in AOL paying $300 million to the SEC and $210 million to the Department of Justice. And Gerald Levin's own public apology given on CNBC in 2010. In it, he said, "I presided over the worst deal of the century, apparently." He said apparently. He wasn't wrong. It started at a private dinner in Manhattan in October 1999. Steve Case and Gerald Levin sat across from each other and sketched what would become the largest corporate merger in history on a napkin. The idea was seductive in its simplicity. AOL had 30 million subscribers and the world's dominant internet brand. But its dial-up infrastructure was already obsolete. Time Warner had HBO, CNN, Warner Brothers, Time Magazine, and critically, cable infrastructure running into millions of American homes. Case's pitch to Levin was this: AOL's internet brand, plus Time Warner's content and cable pipes, equals the company that owns the digital future. What Case did not say at that dinner, what he did not say publicly for years, was that he needed the merger more than Levin did. Levin genuinely believed in the vision. He told his board the deal would transform Time Warner into a company built for the internet age. Case believed in the vision too. But he also believed AOL's stock price had an expiry date. And if he was going to exchange inflated stock for real assets, he needed to move before the market figured out what he already knew. On January 10th, 2000, the deal was announced. AOL stock would be used to acquire Time Warner in an all-stock deal. 55% of the new company would belong to AOL shareholders. Steve Case later said that both he and Levin were focused too much on internal politics and Wall Street and not enough on innovating for customers. That admission is important, but incomplete. The structural problem was that one party to the deal understood the urgency of timing in a way the other did not. When two people negotiate across an information gap that large, one of them is not really negotiating. They are being acquired. The merger was announced on January 10th, 2000. The NASDAQ peaked on March 10th, 2000. 57 days later, the regulatory approval process took over a year. The merger officially closed in January 2001. By the time the ink was dry, the internet stocks that had made AOL worth $226 billion had already begun their collapse. AOL's market value had fallen from $226 billion to roughly $20 billion by the time the dust settled. Levin had agreed to give AOL shareholders 55% of the combined company when AOL was worth $226 billion. He ended up giving them 55% when AOL was worth a fraction of that. One critical decision made this worse than it had to be. During negotiations, Levin had insisted that Time Warner shareholders receive at least half of the new company. Then he changed his mind. He decided it didn't matter what the share ratio was because they were equals. He also chose not to include a price protection clause called a collar. A collar would have allowed Time Warner to recalculate the deal terms if either stock dropped below a certain price before closing. Without that collar, Time Warner shareholders were locked in at AOL's bubble valuation. When the bubble burst, there was no mechanism to adjust. The deal closed on the original terms, into a falling market, with collapsing currency, and no protection. Gerald Levin had the leverage to demand a price protection clause and chose not to use it. He later said he decided it didn't matter because they were equals. That single word, equals, is the most expensive word in corporate history. Two companies are never equals in a negotiation. One always needs the deal more. When you can't tell which one you are almost certainly the one being taken advantage of. The merger closed in January 2001, and the culture war started almost immediately. AOL's culture was fast, aggressive, and entrepreneurial. They had grown from a startup to 30 million subscribers in a decade. They moved fast, and they knew it. Time Warner's culture was institutional. HBO, CNN, and Warner Brothers. Each operated as independent fiefdoms, with decades of editorial tradition and fierce internal autonomy. Time Warner executives who ran profitable businesses generating real cash flow deeply resented being acquired by what they considered an overvalued internet upstart. AOL executives, in turn, viewed their Time Warner counterparts as dinosaurs clinging to analog business models. The promised synergies never materialized because nobody wanted them to. CNN refused to give AOL preferential access to its content. Warner Music resisted digital distribution plans. Time Warner Cable slow-walked efforts to bundle AOL with its broadband service. Neither Time Warner Cable nor Roadrunner Broadband, both owned by AOL Time Warner, made AOL their default platform, so AOL couldn't grow. It could only shrink. The entire logic of the merger, AOL's internet brand delivered through Time Warner's cable pipes, was quietly killed from inside the building by the very people who were supposed to make it work. The merger failed because it was announced but never integrated. Every division of Time Warner that was supposed to support AOL's growth chose not to, and there was no governance structure to force them. This is the pattern in almost every failed merger. The deal gets done, the press release gets written, and the actual work of combining two cultures never happens because the people being combined were never consulted, never convinced, and never willing. While the culture war was playing out inside the building, something else was happening in AOL's accounting department. An investigation later revealed that AOL had been improperly inflating its advertising revenue in the years leading up to and following the merger. The mechanism was called round-trip transactions. AOL would effectively pay companies to place advertising with AOL and then book it as advertising revenue. The money went in a circle, but the revenue looked real. When investigators dug into the books, AOL admitted it had improperly booked at least $190 million in revenue. Several shareholders filed lawsuits, claiming AOL executives had deliberately and fraudulently inflated the value of AOL shares prior to the merger, making the situation more explosive. News emerged that 14 AOL Time Warner executives had sold hundreds of millions of dollars worth of shares shortly after the merger announcement. While employees watched their retirement accounts collapse, the architects of the deal were cashing out. AOL Time Warner eventually paid $300 million to the SEC and $210 million to the Department of Justice to settle the charges. Ted Turner, who had sold Turner Broadcasting System to Time Warner in 1995 and become one of its largest individual shareholders, estimated he personally lost roughly $8 billion, approximately 80% of his net worth, because of the merger. He was not quiet about it. The executives who sold shares after the announcement knew something ordinary employees and shareholders did not. That is not a coincidence. It is a pattern that repeats across corporate disasters. By the time the bad news becomes public, the people who created the situation have usually already exited. The AOL Time Warner collapse wiped out retirement accounts for thousands of ordinary employees. The people at the top walked away with hundreds of millions. The asymmetry is the story. In 2002, AOL Time Warner reported its annual results. The net loss for the year was $98.7 billion, the largest annual loss any company has ever reported in American history. That record still stands. Included in that number was a $99 billion goodwill write-down. The largest write-down in corporate history. Goodwill is the accounting term for the premium paid above an asset's fair value. When AOL used its inflated stock to buy Time Warner, it booked the premium as goodwill. When the stock collapsed, the goodwill had to be written down, all $99 billion of it, in a single accounting period. Gerald Levin resigned in December 2001 before the full scale of the losses became public. Steve Case resigned as chairman in 2003. In 2003, the company removed the word AOL from its name entirely, reverting to Time Warner. In 2009, Time Warner spun off AOL as an independent company. AOL's market capitalization at separation was approximately $3.5 billion. It had been worth $226 billion at the moment the deal was announced. In 2015, Verizon bought AOL for $4.4 billion. The company that had purchased Time Warner for $165 billion sold for $4.4 billion 15 years later. Let's come back to where we started. Two men shook hands on January 10, 2000, and announced the deal of the century. 10 years later, one of them stood in front of a camera and said, "I presided over the worst deal of the century, apparently." The word apparently is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Here is what is not apparently true. It is definitively true. One CEO used inflated currency to buy real assets before the currency collapsed. That was rational. The other CEO failed to protect his shareholders with basic contractual safeguards. That was not. Neither of them built a culture that could integrate two companies whose employees actively refused to cooperate. That was the fatal flaw. $165 billion. $99 billion lost in a single year. Thousands of retirement accounts destroyed. All of it traceable to a dinner in Manhattan in October 1999. Subscribe. The next meeting is worse.